Thank you. And I'm acutely aware that the speaker before lunch is a lot like the corpse at a wake, necessary to the occasion, but not expected to say too much. That having been said, I'd really like to talk with you for a little bit about neuroplastic therapy for CNS disease, because it's a topic that has really grabbed everybody's attention in the last year with potentially explosive data. You know, we're at a point where things that we were predicting 5 years ago are now in the pilot stage, and by this time next year, you're going to see them in the proof stage. And I hope that you'll take time to meet my new partner, Tom Mechtersheimer, who's joined us from Munich. Tom is the founder and CEO of NeuroCare. And in his prior life, Tom was one of the people who really built Fresenius into the $37 billion entity it is today by figuring out how to fully integrate the care for renal disease, for end-stage renal disease and dialysis. And that's really where we see this whole area of neuroplastic therapy for CNS disease going. So we're a public company. Everything I'm saying today is something we know to be true today, but things will change by tomorrow. So CNS disease is really the health challenge of our generation. In the past 50 years, we've witnessed miraculous advances in treating infectious disease, heart disease, cancer, other major causes of death. And at the same time, in the past 50 years, depression, PTSD, autism, traumatic brain injury, ADHD, and other CNS conditions have become society's largest challenge. And all we can celebrate right now is a century of therapeutic failure. Psychotherapy before medication had very low efficacy. The SPEC-D trial demonstrated that traditional antidepressants only work about 30% of the time. PTSD, autism, TBI, cognitive decline, obsessive compulsive disorder, the other conditions that debilitate perhaps as many as a quarter of Americans have no meaningful approved treatments. And the only FDA-approved treatment today for suicidal depression remains electroshock therapy. That's where we are in 2026. Suicide's a national crisis. It kills 50,000 Americans every year. By the time I've ended this talk, another 3 Americans will have died from suicide. And perhaps nobody said this more poignantly than Nolan Williams, who described suicide as a short circuit in the brain, where the brain's cognitive control circuitry is unable to suppress the neural circuitry and underlying negative mood, which in some people can result in severe impairment and thoughts of suicide. By studying the brain's network level differences, we aim to offer tailored solutions for those who've suffered far too long. As you know, Nolan was the genius behind the Stanford Saint protocol, but he said this just a few weeks before he took his own life. We've lost more troops to suicide than to combat. And not only veterans, but first responders, policemen, firemen, and women, paramedics, are 5 times more likely to die by suicide than to die on duty. I'm an aviator in the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary in part of my time. Last year, the Coast Guard lost 14 shipmates to suicide. And even though we dangle people from wires over icy waters, none to operations. Now, we're part of the VA Community Cares program. We're involved with TRICARE in addressing these threats. And suicide is really a strategic threat to force readiness in the United States and to first responder preparedness. Typical, an expert firefighter takes $200,000 in 5 years to train. And if that person's on SSRI antidepressants, that person's not on the truck. A policeman on SSRI antidepressants has to turn in his weapon or her weapon. A pilot is barred for 5 years. So we critically need new technologies because there are 125 drugs approved for depression and they all cause suicide. And perhaps for 70 years, we've really been looking at the wrong neurochemical pathway, serotonin, because none of these drugs has ever been shown to decrease suicidal ideation. And every oral antidepressant carries a black box warning against suicide. In fact, all drugs that raise serotonin levels in the brain cause a side effect or can cause a side effect called akathisia, which occurs in up to 15% of patients on antidepressants. It's a clearly labeled side effect, and yet it's the side effect that caused Stuart Dolan to throw himself in front of a train. It's the side effect that causes people to throw themselves off of roofs. We've lost one of our founding investors to this side effect. But we're finally unlocking the neurobiology of suicide. So I'm not here to depress you before lunch. I hope I'm here to encourage you, because what we've recognized over just the last few years is that all of this is about neuroplasticity, making new connections in the brain. To make it real for you, if you take a teaspoon of sand off the beach, melt it down into a silicon wafer, etch that wafer with a laser, put 10 million transistors onto a single chip, those transistors can be turned on and off through programming, but the connections between the transistors will never change over the life of that chip. That's not how the brain works. The way the brain works is the neurons in the brain are constantly sending out shoots called dendrites that connect to other brain cells. That's how thoughts are formed. That's how memories are formed. And those shoots are constantly being pruned by glial cells and replaced with other shoots. And that's the process of neuroplasticity. And when that stops, really bad things happen to your brain, as I'll explain. Today's approved treatments, NMDA drugs, like ketamine and cycloserine, which are not yet approved for this condition, but are increasingly widely used off-label. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, hyperbaric oxygen, all drive neuroplasticity. Drugs like psilocybin and MDMA, the psychedelics, they may provide advances, but I think the jury's still out as to whether those drugs are effective because of the hallucinations or whether they're effective because of the neuroplasticity they create. They're all 5-HT2C binding drugs. They all create neuroplasticity. It may turn out that the hallucinations are a side effect, that you don't need to actually see God in order to get better with those drugs. And if you look at experimental phase 2 drugs like Transcend 201, you're seeing a whole new generation of drugs that have tweaked the psilocybin and similar molecules, taken out the hallucinogenic side effects, and still have potent neuroplastic effects with very promising clinical effects. Digital therapeutics and other neuromodulation technologies are likely to provide additional benefits, and EEG-guided approaches that use far less energy than TMS and are focused on electrical frequencies in the brain are just around the corner. So if you want to understand the biology of suicide, start with the NMDA receptor. It's an ion channel on the surface of every brain cell that either lets calcium ions into the cell or it doesn't. If you block NMDA, your thoughts are racing out of control. If NMDA is wide open, your thoughts are slowed to a crawl. You don't have many new thoughts per minute. Those thoughts that you have are frequently self-destructive in nature. They're a setup for depression and suicide. And you can see the formation of giant dendrites in the laboratory, connections between cells that are not appropriately pruned by microglia. PTSD, similarly, is a physical wound in the brain. So the rat model of PTSD is pretty simple. Rats have learned over the course of evolution that cats are likely to be lethal. Rats that didn't learn that got eaten. So if you want to give a rat PTSD, all you have to do is put a vial of cat urine in the rat's cage for an hour. And if you, not only will the rat start to exhibit symptoms of PTSD, but if you section that rat's brain, which is something we don't do in humans too often, you'll see inflammatory cells and necrotic debris, just as if that animal had suffered a physical wound. You can see it on fMRI. You can see it on other brain imaging. So we're talking about physical lesions in the brain that we need to address. And if you look at Connor Liston's work, which was pretty much a landmark paper published in Science, ketamine starts to rewire the brain by blocking the NMDA receptor. You can actually see those dendritic spines in a rodent depression model start to sprout within hours of adding ketamine. So you're restoring neuroplasticity with neuroplastic NMDA receptors. And there's now, strong ketamine data from multiple clinical trials, from a French government-funded trial, from NIH-funded trials, where ketamine's been randomized against placebo, where it's been randomized against midazolam, and where it's been randomized against electroshock, where it's far superior to placebo and midazolam, not only in reducing depression within hours, but also reducing suicidality within hours. And officially, it's non-inferior to electroconvulsive therapy in reducing symptoms of depression, except in reality, when you do a post hoc analysis on the PCORI study that was led by Dr. Anand at Harvard, what you see is statistical superiority to electroshock therapy. And of course, the electroshock group had 30% incidence of short-term memory loss, whereas the ketamine group had 0 incidence of memory loss. There's 65,000 patients in the Osmind database that we're going to be bringing to FDA. 20,000 have already been analyzed. This is the 20,000 person analysis, where not only are you seeing a real-world effect of ketamine on suicidality, on symptoms of depression, but you're seeing substantial superiority of intravenous racemic ketamine to intranasal S-ketamine. So there's a lot of promise in this drug as a neuroplastic drug to be treating suicidal depression and PTSD. D-cycloserine, if you think of ketamine as a drug that sort of puts a cork in that NMDA channel, D-cycloserine is much more like turning a faucet. It binds to the glycine site on the NMDA receptor and modulates the channel. And it's the first molecule to show antidepressant effect while directly reducing akathisia in patients with bipolar depression. And unlike direct channel blockers such as ketamine and dextromethorphan, D-cycloserine has no addictive potential. And the hallucinogenic effects, because all NMDA blockers can have hallucinogenic effects, the hallucinogenic effects of D-cycloserine are blocked by small amounts of 5-HT2A antagonists, which is why we've paired it with lurasidone, but other 5-HT2A antagonists work as well. And that's how we wound up with first data showing not only decrease in suicidality, but decrease in akathisia. So whereas all of the 5-HT2A drugs increase akathisia to some degree, and Caplyta, the newest approved drug, increases akathisia less, D-cycloserine showed a marked and statistically significant decrease in akathisia compared to lurasidone alone. And by the way, that was the first clinical trial, to our knowledge, that directly enrolled actively suicidal patients, whereas suicidal patients have been excluded from every clinical trial of antidepressants. So there's no question that neuroplastic drugs play a role in this. Ketamine works within hours, but of course ketamine is neurotoxic over time. If you give 90 doses of ketamine to a primate, you'll cause the brain to turn to Swiss cheese, for lack of a better word. The fancy word is only lesions and excitatory neurotoxicity. Ketamine is addictive, it's hallucinogenic, it can't be given by mouth in a safe manner. It causes vomiting and blood pressure spikes, so it's a wonderful drug for inducing rapid remission, but it's not a drug we think of as a long-term drug. D-cycloserine is a great drug for augmenting the effect, but the kind of dramatic effect we're looking for is not one that we think can be achieved with drugs alone. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a technology that really began coming into clinical use around 2010 to 2012. And we now understand that the reason it works is it creates a potent neuroplastic effect in the brain. It repairs brain pathways by causing neuroplasticity. And now you're talking about a treatment that's given in the office. Some machines are more comfortable than others. Some patients complain of sort of the woodpecker effect, but compared to electroconvulsive therapy, of course, this is a clinically benign treatment. And although it was commercialized 15 years ago, it was a bit of a niche treatment until recently. Because what it can do is activate the dark areas in the brain. The left prefrontal cortex in depression is firing way too slow, and TMS at 10 hertz is believed to elevate the function of the left prefrontal cortex. We know for a fact that it has profound effects on relieving depression, but on EEG, you can see that activation. On MRI, fMRI, you can see that activation. On the other hand, anxiety, PTSD, is much more a function of the right prefrontal cortex firing too fast. And many of the people who are really thought leaders in this field are focusing on using low frequency, like 1 hertz TMS, to calm down the right prefrontal cortex. So all TMS is not created alike, and you're talking about a treatment that's in evolution, that's highly dependent on who's prescribing it and how much they understand about the machine that they're using. The real breakthrough is the surprise finding that when you add D-cycloserine to augment theta burst transcranial magnetic stimulation at low doses, not at the kind of doses that are needed to induce an NMDA blocking antidepressant effect, but at much lower doses, all you get is the neuroplastic effect. Look at the difference you saw between drug and placebo in a randomized controlled trial where everybody got TMS. The people in the dark blue lines got placebo. The people in the light blue lines were augmented with D-cycloserine, and you're seeing more than a doubling of the effect on remission from depression and about an doubling of the effect on response from depression and about an 8-fold effect on remission from depression. As you know, in the 50 years I've been in medicine, I don't think I've ever seen an 8-fold effect of a drug on anything. So this was a randomized controlled trial published by a scientist named McGeer in British Columbia, and he also showed a corresponding reduction in suicidality. These are published in highly respected peer-reviewed journals. And then just a few weeks ago, Roger Vaughan, Jonathan Downer, and their colleagues published a confirmatory study, real-world evidence of D-cycloserine plus TMS for treating depression in a single day, where the patient was given 20 sessions of TMS in a single day, which is a long day. But if you're talking about a healthcare system like the Canadian one, where there's scarce access to resources and long driving distances, a long day may be appropriate for patients. They saw 84% response and 71% remission at 6 weeks with a single day of treatment. Now, by 26 weeks, they'd shown about a 25% relapse rate, but one would think that there would be maintenance treatments that could easily be paired with this to substantially reduce that relapse rate. So when you compare the data that's emerged in the last year, where you're seeing these dramatic effects on response and remission to depression with very short-term treatment protocols, compared to the dismal effectiveness of psychotherapy alone, the 37% response rate from antidepressants alone, the 56% remission rate that was achieved with TMS alone, all of a sudden, we've really crossed a very dramatic threshold in how we think about these diseases. And we're only at the beginning, because right now, most transcranial magnetic stimulation is delivered somewhat blind. You map the motor cortex sort of by trial and error. You position the coil until the patient's thumb twitches. If you want to be really good about it, you use Thomas's new technology for EMG, measuring of when the thumb twitches. But either way, you're kind of mapping the motor cortex by trial and error, and then you're saying, well, let's go 5 centimeters in front of the motor cortex. Well, the minute you do an fMRI or an MRI, and you recognize that everybody's brain is different, and you have precise ability to target the TMS, all of a sudden, you can get much more precise results. And by the time I'm talking to you next year, we're going to be using EEG to do the same thing. Well, MRI does it very well, but it's a multi-million-dollar machine and it's hard to schedule a patient for an MRI. EEG is a cap you can put on the patient in the office. And the third leg of this stool that's critically important to start tracking is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So if you go back to the rats and the cat urine and the PTSD, the guy who did that work wasn't a psychiatrist. He's an Israeli internist who came from the wound healing business. He was in the business of saving diabetic legs. Made this discovery about PTSD being a wound in the brain, said, let's put those people in a hyperbaric chamber. And all of a sudden, you have the first therapy that has demonstrated a 40% reduction in CAPS-5, which is the PTSD symptom scale for battlefield PTSD. The Israeli Defense Forces are putting about 200 soldiers a day into hyperbaric chambers to treat PTSD. There's a bill before the Senate right now demanding that this be made available to American soldiers as well. So you're talking about a therapy that was never thought of as a therapy for behavioral disease, for CNS disease, all of a sudden coming to the fore, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it. Digital therapeutics is an area that I got involved with around 2000, 2001, when a group of special forces operators figured out that their combat effectiveness improved with meditation. And as you figure out that that works by synchronizing breathing and heart rate, all of a sudden you're able to reduce levels of autonomic stress and demonstrate substantial improvements in depression just by teaching people to synchronize breathing and heart rate. So what we've started to focus on is integrated neuroplastic care, where we aim to be able to return a soldier, a veteran, a first responder, firefighter, police officer, paramedic to duty within a month through a combination of ketamine, transcranial magnetic stimulation, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, digital therapeutics. And in the pilot program we're achieving that about 90% of the time. If you're really able to combine talk therapy and effective cognitive therapy with these neuroplastic technologies, the likelihood of being able to put a firefighter back on the truck looks like it's about 90% from a disease that was causing massive disability and loss of service. And to do so at a highly cost-effective cost per care, even if it's $25,000, which is more than most of these episodes of care cost, that cost is far less than the cost of an episode of cardiac disease, breast cancer, prostate cancer, brain tumor, and yet you're treating people who are far younger, who have far more discounted healthy years of life at stake to be saved. So if integrated care is key to delivering the best practice outcome, you need a footprint with which to do it. And here's the current footprint of people who have TMS machines installed that also have software to create that platform that not only provides the care platform, but provides a training academy that can certify technicians, that can certify caregivers, that can really integrate the patient's care. And I hope that by the time I'm with you next year, we're going to be showing you the results from that platform. So it's an honor to have been invited by Leonard. Always a pleasure to be part of the SACS Forum, and please enjoy your lunch.